What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. There's a strange irony unfolding right now in Russia. The Kremlin spent years screaming about imaginary Western plots, NATO encirclement, and foreign enemies supposedly trying to break the historical unity of the Russian state. But now, when you look closely at the latest leaks from the inside Russia's own security apparatus, the FSB, a much more embarrassing fear emerges. The Kremlin is not panicking really about Washington, it's not panicking about Brussels, it's not even panicking about Kiev, not at all. The nightmare keeping Moscow awake truly at night is China. Yes, that very same no-limit partner, the country Putin hugs in front of cameras while promising eternal friendship and strategic brotherhood. Because behind the curtains inside the walls of the FSB, Beijing is officially labeled as the enemy. And the reason? Russia is terrified that China might one day take back the land Russia stole 160 years ago, including Vladivostok, the jewel of the Far East. This entire story is the most revealing glimpse we've gotten of Putin's geopolitical bluff. On the outside, he pretends Russia and China are unbreakable allies. On the inside, he fears Beijing's long memory, long borders, and even longer ambitions. That fear grew so intense that the Russian counterintelligence drafted an internal 8-page report warning that China is researching ancient Chinese people in Russia's Far East. Sounds familiar, right? Renaming also Russian cities with Chinese historical names, infiltrating Arctic projects, inserting its spies into universities, and quietly building influence along 2,600-mile border that Russia barely has the manpower to monitor. Once again, all this according to the FSB report to Putin. So today, let's dive into the most awkward partnership on Earth. A partnership built on paranoia, historic humiliation, shifting alliances, and a balance of power that is now collapsing entirely in China's favor. A partnership where weaker side, unfortunately for the Kremlin, Russia, is starting to understand that when you kneel to survive, it is usually extremely, very hard, almost impossible to stand up, back up, and be proud. And so the question emerging from all this is simple. China once lost the territories that Russia stole. And now, since Russia is isolated, weakened, indebted, and independent, so is Beijing preparing to collect? Because if not now, then when? Let's begin with the most explosive part of the FSB leak. Russia's own security service admits that Beijing is actively promoting the narrative for reclaiming parts of the Russian Far East. Not Crimea, not Donbass, not anything Ukraine-related, but Russian territory itself. Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, territories whose loss China still considers part of its historical humiliation at the hands of imperial powers. To understand the depth of Russian fear, you have to revisit the 19th century, when the Qing dynasty was collapsing under internal rebellions, opium wars, and imperial invasions. Russia took advantage of the chaos, and in 1858 and 1860, under the Treaty of Aigun and the Convention of Pekin, China ceded over approximately 600,000 square kilometers of land to Russia. That includes the entire Primorye region and the port city Russians lovingly call Vladivostok. The Chinese name, by the way, literally translates as Sea Cucumber Bay. Not exactly poetic, but, well, far more historically accurate, I guess. So, why shouldn't China take advantage of chaos inside Russia now? Moscow considers that territory unquestionably Russian. Beijing considers it unquestionably stolen. And the leaked FSB memo shows China is no longer shy about reminding everyone of that history. In 2023, Beijing ordered that all new Chinese maps must use the original Chinese names for Vladivostok and 7 other Russian cities. The FSB called it a dangerous ideological operation. It's not like Bakhmut and Artyomovsk, you don't understand, it's different. Translation, basically, Kremlin panicked. But here's the funniest part. When confronted with those concerns, China simply smiles and calls Russia a dear friend, a partner in peace, a good neighbor. Meanwhile, Russia knows perfectly well that good neighbors don't research your ancient populations, rename your cities, infiltrate your universities, and analyze your defense routes in the Arctic unless they're preparing for a long game. A game that Russia is now too weak and too broke to stop. There was a time when Moscow could intimidate Beijing, but that era is over now, obviously. Today, Russia fears China the same way a man fears a lender he owes too much money to, and the FSB report proves it. But how did Russia and China even transition from strategic partners to suspicious rivals? Let's talk about it now, next chapter. This entire no-limits partnership was always more than theater than substance. two authoritarian regimes posing together for photos united by shared hatred of American influence. But I mean, just scratch that polished surface and you will find mistrust, resentment, and historical trauma that no handshake between Putin and Xi Jinping can ever erase. Back in the Cold War, the Sino-Soviet split shattered a relationship for generations. The United States used that split to build a temporary strategic friendship and kind of partnership with China against Moscow. And although today Washington is once again China's top rival, the memory of Soviet arrogance still lingers deeply in Chinese political culture. Fast forward to the 2000s, as Russia declined and China rose, Putin and Xi Jinping crafted an alliance built mostly on convenience. Russia wanted markets for oil and weapons, China wanted a partner that would distract the West. But under that alliance were two very different paths. China soared, Russia stagnated. Now the war in Ukraine has completely shattered wherever balance existed. Russia became a pariah, China became the only lifeline. The scales tipped so dramatically that even Chinese banks began reducing cooperation, fearing that Western sanctions more than they value Russian friendship. Meanwhile, the FSB insists that China is recruiting Russia students, recruiting even Russian married to Chinese citizens, and sending agents to dig for classified information about Russian military tech and then also Western weapons recovered on Ukrainian battlefields. Beijing does not want Russia as a partner. It wants Russia as a window into NATO technology and a test subject for modern warfare. And the paranoia is mutual. The FSB memo describes the relationship as tense and dynamically developing. Literal quote. That's a polite way of just saying we're smiling in public, but behind the curtain we're plotting against each other. The alliance is cracking because it was never built on trust, only on necessity. And right now, the only side with freedom to choose is China. How did it even get to this point? How did Russia become so weak and how did China find the perfect time to make the move? Let's talk about it in our next chapter. There is a power shift that Moscow refuses to acknowledge publicly. China has become so dominant partner in every sphere, economic, military, diplomatic, strategic, and Russia simply now cannot even travel without China. It cannot trade without China, it cannot survive sanctions without China. And when a country becomes so dependent, the partner becomes the master. Central Asia, for example, is the clearest example. For 2 centuries it was Russia's backyard, while today it's China's master, China's marketplace. Chinese investments, Chinese infrastructure, Chinese military cooperation, all expanding while Russia bleeds out and is distracted in Ukraine. Even countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan now look to Beijing more than to Moscow for influence and economic opportunities. What about the entire continent of Africa? Guess what? China builds ports, roads, factories. In the meantime, Russia sends Wagner mercenaries to loot minerals and support unstable clans. But even those operations are collapsing under battlefield defeats and leadership chaos. What about the Arctic region then? China wants access to the Northern Sea route, a future shipping superhighway. Russia can barely guard the region. The Far East then? Chinese yuan has replaced the ruble in many transactions. Chinese companies dominate timber, mining and infrastructure. Even Russian citizens themselves prefer the stability of Chinese currency over their own collapsing ruble. I mean, that should speak about something. And then comes the demographic myth, the idea that China wants to, for some reason, send waves of settlers into Siberia. Well, it's not true, and China simply does not even need it. Beijing's population is already shrinking. Heilongjiang province, the one right across from Russia, is losing people every year. They do not want to move to permafrost. Why should they? They want to move to Shanghai. The real Chinese expansion is economic, not demographic. Yuan replaces ruble, Chinese companies replace Russian ones, Chinese influence replaces Russian power. This is how you take land without firing a single shot. First the economy, then the politics, then the leverage. And when everything is in its perfect place, territory stops being Russian not just by invasion, but by irrelevance. Let's ask probably the most uncomfortable question Putin does not want to hear. If Russia claims Ukraine as historically Russian, then why would not China claim Vladivostok as historically Chinese? If Russia can rewrite borders in the 21st century, why cannot Russia rewrite the treaties of 1858? Taiwan's president recently gave Beijing a brilliant suggestion. If you want historical justice, he said, start with Outer Manchuria, not Taiwan. A comment dripping with geopolitical sarcasm, but also painfully true. Because if Russia continued its war into second decade, if sanctions deepen, if casualties rise, if the economy collapses, if the regional instability spreads, then China will stand over a weakened Russia the same way Russia once stood over a weakened Qing dynasty. And history, as we all know, guys, has a very funny way of repeating itself. Maybe China will not demand territory openly. Maybe it will push for administrative access or just joint development zones, special port privileges or expanded military cooperation, all of which just basically are diplomatic ways of saying that this land is becoming slowly ours. And if Russia collapses, which is no longer a fantasy, the Far East could fall into China's sphere naturally. Not through tanks, but through vacuum. Moscow can barely control border regions today. Imagine if Russia reduced solely to its western core, with Siberia fractured into smaller states. Who will stop China then? Just who? Russia's elites know this. That's why the FSB calls China the enemy behind the closed doors. The empire that once humiliated China now bends the knee to its former victim. The 19th century master becoming the 21st century puppet. History does not forgive arrogance, and wars do not forgive weakness. In the end, this entire story is not really about Vladivostok or treaties signed in 1860. It's about what happened to a country when it overreaches, isolates itself, destroys its economy, and starts a war it cannot win. Russia once believed it was reviving an empire. Well, instead, it is watching its own borders grow fragile. It once imagined itself a global superpower, the only one. Now it is clutching China like a drowning man clutching a rope, well, just not realizing that the rope is slowly tightening around his own neck. The FSB report is not just a security memo, it's a confession. A confession that Russia fears its greatest partner more than its greatest enemies. A confession that Putin has driven the country into such dependence that even ancient Chinese land claims suddenly feel realistic. A confession that the future of the Far East might not be decided in Moscow, but in Beijing. Empires collapse quietly at first, through fear, through denial, through self-destruction. And sometimes through the simple just realization that the land you once stole now has the owner powerful enough to take it back. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more just like this. If you wish to join our private Telegram group, you can do so by becoming YouTube channel member or Patreon member. The links are down below. You will instantly receive an invitation link. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.